Welcome back. Welcome back to the 2 p.m. session for Hispanics in Philanthropy presents Ecosystem of Social Change, moderated by Chris Cardona. Welcome back. Now introducing to Hispanics in Philanthropy presents Ecosystem of Social Change, moderated by Chris Cardona. Trustee, Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation.
Thank you. All right. All right. Thank you all so much. And I will invite the speakers to remove their masks or not, as you wish, while we are on stage. Look at that. Isn't this a nice change of pace? The bottom half of people's faces. God, haven't you missed that? I know maybe I haven't missed the, questions about how much more, salt there used to be amidst the pepper on my beard since the last time I was showing the bottom half of my face that much, but here we are. What are we gonna do? I'm Chris Cardona. I am a trustee at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation in Arkansas. I'm also a senior program officer at the Ford Foundation in New York. And here we are in LA. Our people are in many places and do many things. We have an amazing panel today to talk about the ecosystem of social change. And the question before us really is, what does it take to create an equitable recovery from the crises of the last 18 months? And not just the last 18 months, right? That's part of the issue, is that there are so many things from so long that our communities are looking to overcome. And it feels especially important at this moment of growing Latina leadership to reflect on this topic of cross-sector collaboration, because it feels so important how we exert power as Latina folks, as Latino leaders in philanthropy. Because as tempting as it is to give in to some of the energy that comes at us sometimes from the majority community, there's nothing special about us. We're just the same as everyone else. But our experiences, our families, our lives, those are what are different. Those are what give us insight and give us the ability to bring something different to the dimension of leadership. And philanthropy feels like an important case for testing out what it looks like to have Latina leadership that exerts power in a different and more inclusive and more equitable way. So we have a moment here to think about the role of collaboration across sectors when it comes to that type of leadership? What will that look like? Because the cliches of our field, oh, philanthropy shouldn't focus on filling the gaps where government isn't able to go. Oh, government is slow and unresponsive. Oh, the philanthropy is set in its ways. We've seen those have all been upended in the last 18 months. We can move more agilely. We can be more collaborative. So what is it going to take now to make those changes stick? To take that newfound agility and collaboration and responsiveness and build it into the new normal? Well, thankfully, we have our panel here to work us through those important questions. So I want to ask you all, and folks have people's bios in their material, so I won't go into, take the whole panel to list all of their accomplishments. But I want to ask you all to start, and whoever would like to pick up on this, feel free. These last 18 months, with regard to cross-sector collaboration, philanthropy, government, nonprofits, companies, has it really been that different? Or has this been business as usual? What's different, if anything, about cross-sector collaboration over these last 18 months? Marco, I see you leaning forward. That means you get to answer first.
I didn't mean to lean forward to talk. I just meant to see who was going to go first. What I would say is that the relationships are largely still there as they were before the pandemic. I think in some ways that hasn't changed. There was a fair amount of interaction, as I think my colleagues will elaborate on, between, for example, philanthropy and grantees, and the conversation was already shifting. I think there were trends in philanthropy responding to communities more than they had been in the past. And of course, I think I'm on the panel to sort of help offer also sort of a perspective around the policy world in Washington, D.C. in particular, but the policy world in general. And I think there were even some relationships there. I think the nature of the relationships have changed, and the process by which change is trying to be achieved has shifted, right? I think the pandemic did two things. One, it illustrated a very acute set of needs in communities, in particular in low-income communities, communities of color, Latino, Latina, Latinx communities, that in fact were disproportional, again, that pre-existed before the pandemic, but they were brought to light. They were put in stark relief as a result of the pandemic. And what it did was it forced the powers that be, including philanthropy, to no longer be able to claim to not understand or be as familiar with the challenges communities were facing, especially because in many ways they've been exacerbated even more than they had in the past. And so I think a sense of urgency developed. There was an increase in a real responsiveness from the part of philanthropy. And then similarly, I think communities and organizations were able to really channel the energies they'd been already, again, doing before towards highlighting the needs, the specific needs, and both the short-term, the immediate needs, as well as longer-term needs to try to address the problems and the challenges that, again, that were pernicious, that were systemic, that need long-term solutions well beyond this current moment, the pandemic. And then the one other thing I'll add is that I think also what it illustrated, however, one of the places where I think a gap was illustrated was in engagement around the part of communities at the federal policy level. I think communities have been very good with increasing effectiveness at engaging policymakers at the state and local level. California is a real model for that, as folks might share. But I think I still see in Washington, particularly as compared to many other constituencies, I see a relative lack of voice and perspective from our community in the Washington and the federal policymaking space. And again, I think as we saw through this pandemic, there are things that are really huge and macro level that require a federal policy solution, as well as implementation and solutions and changes at the state and local level. And so that's one of the things I think that as a result of the pandemic, we've seen the delay in the types of supports, whether it was the relief funds whether it was the stimulus checks, whether it was many other things that were determined at the Washington level, our community oftentimes was either the last or the least considered, or sometimes even overlooked, or sometimes in fact targeted based on legalization status, that kept them from receiving the kind of support that, again, they needed just as much and sometimes more than many other populations. So I'll stop there and see if my colleagues want to elaborate or disagree.
Vanessa, I saw you nodding along there as Marco was speaking.
I would agree. I think that one of the things that is required for sure is the trust and the relationship that has been built over the years. And that has been where we are now, I think, in our relationships, cross-sector, not collaborations, cross-sector, is a product of years of investment of building that trust and having strong relationships. I would say that one thing I think that's been incredible from a philanthropic and from a community perspective with our philanthropic partners, and I should have started with this, but I'm with Alliance for a Better Community, and we're a local Latino advocacy organization based out of Los Angeles County, is that in the same way we have asked our community to be at the center of our finding policy solutions, we have seen our relationship with philanthropy putting us at the center of what it is that is needed to ensure that we can do the work and continue to be as effective as we are. And so whether it's been in the grant making or getting the doing disbursements of cash assistance, or it's been understanding more what the immediate urgency is for the policy change that has to happen in order for the systemic change to happen, we have seen the finger on the pulse of community through our organizations. And that's been something that I believe comes after years of both trusting that both partners are critical as we look at systemic change. So I think the power dynamic has shifted in so that community-based organizations, community and philanthropy and other sectors understand what we need and the roles that we each play. The other thing I would say is that there's also a greater understanding of the issues. The connectivity of the issues. The solutions may not have all surfaced yet through cross-sector collaborations. There's certainly agreement in some of the solutions, but I would say that there's a lot more awareness of how, for instance, if you're talking about a workforce issue, that you also need to be mindful of the childcare issue. If you're talking about a health issue, the connection to education, now there's a lot more talk about mental health awareness and being able to look at solutions and how we're implementing policy changes and services and making sure we meet the needs of our communities at all levels. So I think that awareness is been heightened. And I think that's going to move us closer to finding not just surfacing the solutions, but growing the necessary supports that we need. So it's not just my organization or my collaboration of organizations working on this issue together, but it's the support of different sectors to also lift up the same narrative and look at those solutions and how that is being implemented in the work that others are doing.
What are some of those necessary supports? What needs to be there to further enable collaboration between the sectors in y'all's experience?
I can jump in just because I'm really resonating with all of that. I think at Native Americans in Philanthropy, one of the things that we realized pretty early on when the pandemic hit, and we were really one of the most important national resources for funders across the country to really learn about Native-led response funds, the needs, where the dollars needed to go, was that there was a story that was emerging very quickly that this wasn't about how did philanthropy respond to the needs of our communities, but it was really more about how were our communities organizing and raising resources and distributing those resources to where they needed to be. And we've known that for a very long time, and we've been trying to communicate this, I think, at the community level for quite a while. But I think what the pandemic really sort of exposed in a good way was that it was a good opportunity for us to tell philanthropy to take a step back, let go of as much power as possible, invest in these community-led organizations, and they're going to show you what happens. We did a report over the first 6 months of of the pandemic that showed that, just the native-led response funds we were in contact with raised over $32.8 million in the first 6 months of the pandemic, and got those out through mutual aid networks, youth coalitions, and any number of different kinds of grassroots organizing. And I think that was really, for me, the sort of power that I hope we can move forward when it comes to the cross-sector collaboration, because we're always struggling with trying to explain these sectors and why the silos are actually a problem. And the pandemic exposed major system-wide issues, from the childcare connection to, in our communities, we've been organizing around food sovereignty and rebuilding our indigenous food systems for a long time. And wow, did the pandemic open up all of the problems with our current Western industrial food systems, right? So on one level, it exposed these big systemic issues for a broader audience, but at the same time, our community organizations and networks and relationships and relatives were all there doing what they do every day, and all of these other things, from the census to voter activation to you name it. So I think it's about bringing those stories together and then really showcasing why we need to keep investing in community-led coalitions and organizations and programs who've been doing this work for a really long time. And that was a lot of what we felt like we were learning out of it.
Antonia, you're at the California Community Foundation. You've led that institution here for many years. Hearing what Marco and Vanessa and Eric are talking about, what resonates for you, the experience of the last 18 months here in Los Angeles about collaboration across the sectors?
Well, first, I'd like to go back to the question that you raised, and that is what has changed in philanthropy and what hasn't. And we don't really know what hasn't, because we're still in the middle of it. But I will make a couple of points. As head of a community foundation, we are in the community. We've been an activist for a long time. We've been funding power building for a long time. And so our connection to the community was there. Our networks were there. And I would say for philanthropy and it's Hispanic Latinos and philanthropy, is there's too few of us yet to really make a difference. And we have to be realistic about it. But I think that the future is in power building, and power building in a way that communities can engage in the process of change. That's one. Secondly, philanthropy is venture capital. It's minuscule compared to really the resources coming from the public sector, because it's the public sector that really has the funds, to address the issues that our community cares about. So the question for philanthropy is, how do we engage and partner with the public sector in order to facilitate the flow of dollars to our community? And understanding, the public sector is a regulator. They're not consumer friendly. And that's where community foundations and local foundations come into play, because our job is to know our community. I'm the head of the California Community Foundation. Our focus in is LA County. What we bring to the table is knowledge of the issues of our community, and having my staff be in the community partnering. Now, as to your question of collaboration, collaboration is wonderful if you come from a position of understanding your power base and what you have collaborate with, because then you can collaborate on a give and take situation. And I think Latinos have not been very good at collaborating, to be honest with you. Collaborating means being at the table. Well, for me, collaborating, being at the table and influencing that table as to the decision that has been made. And I think that that's where, Latinos should understand our position and not be afraid to take risks and articulate the needs of our community, because that's what we're there. Marco said something that's really important, and that is, the lack of national presence at the national level. I was there 40 years ago and not much has changed. And unfortunately, there is a lack of voice for the Latino community in Washington, D.C. And that's something that we have to really focus on, because, other ethnic groups, other special groups are united in understanding their agenda. And we have yet to articulate a national agenda that we can put our strength behind. For us, we're activists. We engage in the public policy arena, but we do it at the local level, at the regional level, and at the state level. And we have begun slowly, but it's minuscule. It's one small community foundation. And I would say for those of you who work in national philanthropy, when I was at MALDEF, national philanthropy has to fund public policy advocacy because it doesn't come for free. And philanthropy is still, in my view, too risk adverse. Our community is ready for change, but it needs the resources to activate that change. And that's where philanthropy is. But I don't think we should fool ourselves. You know, we yet do not have the power base and the influence. And when we do, I don't think we exercise it as effectively as we should. So I would say, and I know this is not a pleasant thing to say, they didn't put me in this position to be pretty and nice. Okay, they put me in this position to influence, you know, not just Latinos, it's not just an ethnic thing, to influence the policies to make life better for all community, but particularly for poor community. And if we focus on that, we're focusing on our community and we're doing the collaborative work that you, Chris, enunciated.
That's it. Love it. So let's talk more about what that looks like in practice, right? Like what would it look like to exercise that leverage more, to be at the table, you know, not just be at the table, but to influence. What does that look like?
Well, I'm going to say it again. You fund organizing, you fund community building, you put resources in risky endeavors. You don't ask for a lot of data that you never use and burn nonprofits with a lot of process. You give multi-year commitments and you give general operating support. It's not a secret, okay? It's very simple. That's how simple it is.
Everything she just said.
So that's the perspective from philanthropy, and agree that these are things that have been said from stages like this for many years. And at the same time, working with community organizations, working with the federal government, you know, the experience of Native nations and Native-led nonprofits, working with philanthropy, we all have a role to play, right? To the image that Ana Maria was using, what seats we're in on the bus and and what the routes are that we're pursuing. Vanessa, I'm wondering from your perspective, from a community-based organization, yes, funders need to do all of the things that Antonia said. From the community organization perspective, what needs to happen? What are some of those types of support, in addition to what Antonia said, that are needed to have more effective collaboration to support those kinds of coalitions that are emerging that Eric talked about?
Some of the most effective funding that we get are from, that we receive are from partners, philanthropic partners that understand to our core who we are, what we do, and what is happening and what the impacts have been. There are concerns from a lot of our partners. I would say that, you know, I've shared in conversations with about capacity. There are concerns about, and not just the capacity to understand the work and to do the work, but the capacity as humans, right? We are also mothers and fathers, and we're caring for our parents and other extended family. There's concern around the leadership pipeline, right? Whether we are creating the opportunities for the next generation that my generation and others had in the future. I think understanding the additional burdens that we don't get to talk about very often, because it's not a subject that a lot of different people ask us about, right? It's being able to have that candid conversation without scaring off a funder. right? We're not saying that we can't do this. We're just saying we need a pause and we need to really think about how we're taking these next steps. And that takes time. Long-term investment is key. The change doesn't happen overnight. And though the giving for direct assistance, you can see the immediate change. Now the person can pay for their rent for 1 month. Now mom has money to put food on the table. That's great, but that's not making the systemic change. So we don't have to continue to respond this way. And I think being cognizant of the fact that this takes time, right? The trust that we have with community is sacred, and how we can turn that into data when it's needed and how we can turn that into mobilizing is incredible, right? And in California, we have 20 years of experience from leaders that have been invested in this movement to develop this infrastructure and this immense capacity. But we have to care for it and invest in it long-term to see us be able to build off of that and make it thrive. And so I would say that looking at it from a long-term perspective and being able to have the candid conversations, if you really want to know what's happening, then we'll share, but it has to be a safe space.
Right, it can't just be a one-off thing in response to some urgent need. There needs to be that context of the investment in that relationship. What excites you all about some of the collaborations that have been able to emerge across sectors over the last 18 months? It's been an incredibly difficult time for so many, and that urgency has created new partnerships, new coalitions of the type you were talking about, Eric. What encourages you, what excites you about some of the cross-sector partnerships that you've seen emerge in your worlds in the last 18 months?
I mean, I'll jump in. I think I'm really excited, actually. I'm a lot more excited than I would have thought I'd be at this point, back in February when at least this whole pandemic mess started. I think a lot of what's been exciting in our world is just the innovation behind Native-led nonprofit structures, particularly those that have a lot of intermediary funding capacity. There are so many networks of trust and deep relationships across our nonprofit sector. And I think for too long, we haven't really been able to focus on those and to think as Native people, what do we mean when we say network? We're talking about our relatives and our relations in the field, people who are in our communities, generations of support and resource and knowledge. And I think for too long, an intermediary sort of funder was always looked at as this kind of like transactional sort of thing. And really what we're seeing are, coalitions that are both doing lots of organizing with all our urban Indian nonprofits, but also those that are working with our tribal governments around food systems that have the capacity to both be able to take in resources, but to ensure that those resources are getting to the ground in a good way in our communities. And from that, we've seen just so much new leadership develop. I think the second thing that I've been really excited about on the cross-sector piece is just going back to the system breakdown. I feel like these systems that we've been talking about are so out in the open as far as how messed up they are. And I'd like to throw climate and conservation in there too, because we're doing a lot of work to try to really figure out how can we start to bring climate and conservation funders around some of these other community priorities that they've been ignoring for far too long. But that's because we're looking at things holistically as Native people. And finally, we're having conversations that are more holistic about this work. We're getting some of those public policy partners at the table. And I've just seen a lot of philanthropic policy and nonprofit partners working together in a new way because the conversations are different about these systems. And so I hope that that continues, because it's been something we've been kind of trying to communicate about for a long time, but I guess it took the confluence of a pandemic and the breakdown of our democracy and a lot of other things for people to kind of finally start to see why this is such an issue, and we need to think really differently, especially at these sector levels, about this work.
And we work with about 20 collaboratives because it's at that point in time, and it's in those places that people get to know each other and solve problems. But you asked the question, what excites us? Well, excited more like concern. I mean, if you think about is what's the role of philanthropy with the billions of dollars that are going to flow into your community? What influence are you going to have? I'll give you a couple of examples. A lot of the long-term solutions are nerdy solutions. They're solutions that require long-term commitment. As an example, you know, the earned income tax credit, the increase in the food stamps by 25%. That could technically alleviate poverty by a substantial percent. Do philanthropy fund getting people signed up? Do they fund local organizations that will get people signed up for that? Because that's a permanent solution. That's a long-term solution. So I think sometimes philanthropy, you know, sort of kind of doesn't look deep into the immediate solutions that can be had by funding community outreach, whether it's signing up for food stamps, CalFresh, whether it's the income, you know, the earned income tax credit, and all of those things that bring resources to our community. And if you think about it, money coming into your local community is not just to a family or an individual, it's to the grocery store, it's to the Ross, it's to the Marshalls, because they're going to spend it immediately because they need it. So I think, you know, we need to think right now, what excites me and concerns me is what impact will we have with the billions of dollars? How will we work with the public sector to help them and partner with them to make sure that that money is spent effectively and efficiently and it goes to the right people? So I think that's another issue that philanthropy has to think about and move quickly. This is not, you know, studying it for 2 years and then seeing that it's implemented on the 3rd year, and on the 4th and the 5th you get bored and go something else. This is sticking with issues long-term and seeding them and rooting them so they have the long-term impact that we want.
Yeah, I've got a couple of things I'm optimistic about. I don't know if I'm yet at the point of excitement, but I think there's a lot of potential for, although I've been accused of being hopelessly optimistic. So we'll see. One is bring in an element that hasn't been talked about in the ecosystem that is our world and our society, the private sector. I think the last 2 years have shown, I'm hoping it lasts and it is deep, but there's at least been initial signs of a potential new shift in the area of the private sector. First, in response to the pandemic, corporations springing into action to try to provide relief, whether it be to their constituents, their communities, or to their employees. Some corporations faster than others, some corporations were dragged kicking and screaming, but regardless, I think the result is that folks have started to move into that. And then I think it must be said, because we're talking about our world today and we can't sort of isolate even the issues, much the way we don't isolate the topics folks work on, which is all of the awakening that took place beginning last summer after the attention on the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, and the fact that there were so many others, also I think caused this, I think, fairly genuine beginning of a crisis of conscience, such that I think we're seeing the private sector now begin to take positions and begin to direct dollars. And for me, I think that has the potential, if it doesn't just sort of recede and go back to the way things were after this, it has the potential to change the dynamics, because those are going to be added to the public sector dollars and the philanthropic dollars going into communities going forward in new ways, right? In ways that haven't been before. And whereas there's still, I'm not Pollyannish, and I know there's still a lot of work to be done in the private sector, to mitigate some of the issues, because in some cases, some of the private sector entities are the ones who prop up some of these systems and inadvertently and sometimes intentionally perpetuate inequities. The reality is, again, that even the fact that these conversations have begun and that they're not purely isolated to the most extreme fringe, to me, has great potential. So for me, that's one thing I think that really has the potential to change the dynamic of conversation, especially when you get to the community level in terms of how individual people's lives. They're not being seen purely as consumers anymore. They're potentially being seen as members of a community. So that's one. and the other two will be faster.
That's quite all right.
The second point is, I think something that excited me was, and speaking back to my point about sort of the federal policy arena was, again, the pandemic forced folks to recognize what immediate need there was at a community level and the direct relationship between the local and the state and the national, such that you have individual members of Congress, and I want to applaud, and I want to mention, by the way, in case there's any doubt, my critique of a lack of voice in Washington by no means discounts. In fact, my argument is the members of the Hispanic caucus, some of whom are my bosses, are doing, I think, a really great job in Washington. There's just too few of them, and there's not enough backup for them. They are often lone voices in Congress, and there isn't necessarily the advocacy organizations, the lobbying, grassroots lobbying groups, the community organizations, the community members adding their voices so that it reaches a crescendo and adds the kind of pressure that's needed. But my point was that, interestingly, because of what this illuminated was, you have members of Congress now fighting day and night at the local level in their districts. They've taken it, and this is permeated not just in the Latino community, but throughout Congress, where people had to realize it wasn't just something where they did stuff in the abstract and they just passed legislation and they just approved millions of dollars, but they had to look after and find ways to be stakeholders. So district offices became so much more active and engaged than they ever had before. And it wasn't just the groups who had the savvy enough to know how to access members of Congress that were interacting now. It was many, many other groups than had before. And for me, that also has some potential for new relationships, for new dynamics, for new infrastructure, because again, that is potentially a portal through which many, many more community and local voices can potentially be represented in Washington. And then the last thing I wanted to say that I'm excited about is going back to a point Vanessa made, which was about the leadership pipeline. At the end of the day, the systems that we're talking about were laid bare as a result of the pandemic, as a result of this social upheaval, are held up, are supported, sometimes are perpetuated by people, by individuals. And again, that's one of the things I think that we've been forced to reckon with through, again, as people call them, the twin pandemics of systemic racism and the COVID pandemic and economic inequality, et cetera, is that people have come to realize at the end of the day, what a lot of these things and these processes and these issues we're wrestling with boil down to people. We need to change more people's minds. We need more climate. We need more people to be taking action. It's not something that's going to happen randomly by itself. Artificial intelligence is not going to solve these things for us, right? And so what I think that's made room for is a conversation around the fact that when we look at the people driving systems, the people who control resources, looking at you too, Philanthropy, but not only you, the people who are in decision-making positions, they don't look like America. Yeah. And that's part of the problem. And that's also something that's not new, that's been said from stages like this for many, many more years. But people, I think, again, I'm optimistic, are listening to it more than ever. And so we're creating openings for people to recognize that what we need is to invest in developing more people, to recognize the realities, as Vanessa was saying, that individuals face, that they sometimes already wear 5 hats. So it's not as simple to say to them, just wear a 6th one and come brief us on all the issues in your community, right? But that there needs to be also longer term investment in leaders to help them move through the process and to help them be able to represent not just themselves, not just their families, not even just their communities, but really society at large, and actually to add their talent, their innovation, their creativity, which I argue is completely underutilized in the Latino community, from the Latino community, I should say. We have it and other folks aren't taking advantage of it. I think this is the beginning potentially of a new era where people will hear from more and more Latinos, Latinas, and Latinx brilliance, and will actually act on it, and will actually start to make better and faster progress than we ever have before.
Vanessa, please jump in on that. I also want to invite folks if they're to get ready for questions that they may have, and also for folks that are streaming, if you want to send in your questions. I believe there's staff folks who can make sure to convey those to us to make sure to ask our esteemed panel. Vanessa, please.
So many reactions to what, some of the last comments that were said, but I'll try to keep this brief. First, excitement is hard to have in this period. On the right day, I'll have excitement, but usually it is more optimism than anything else. And the optimism is because the investments are coming down the pipeline and we can actually have an impact and make change. Exactly what Antonio was saying about the poverty and raising kids out of poverty, the investments, the billions of dollars that are coming down into education. There is an opportunity to deliver the change faster than we ever imagined. But I think what dissipates the excitement is the concern that we can only do this time. This opportunity that we have right now won't happen again, I don't believe, unless, I mean, and I don't want to think about another pandemic. There's a horrible movie on Amazon, by the way. It's called COVID-24. I don't recommend watching it.
I love it, an anti-recommendation. Nice.
And I think that's the concern, is what happens if we don't seize this opportunity in a way that's effective, in a way that's inclusive, in a way that is in alignment with what's happening with reality, right? Great unemployment benefits, but only 30% of Latinos in California that were eligible accessed the unemployment benefits. Our children whose parents had mixed status were not able to receive the CARES relief funds. The child tax credit now, again, same issue. Don't file taxes regularly. Where are they going to be able to access the proper documentation that they need to access the funds and critical funds that are needed? But I'll also say that on the representation part and the leadership part, we have to be at the table. We have to influence the table. People at the table have to look like us, but we have to cultivate the understanding and raise the awareness of what the issues mean. Just because we have, I'll take Los Angeles, for instance, as an example, just because we have almost 5 million Latinos in LA County and more than 30% of those can vote, doesn't mean that we're going to be able to vote on progressive measures at the local or the statewide level. We have to cultivate an understanding of what that means. And oftentimes when we have leaders that look like us, they've missed some of that. And we need to make sure that when we talk to community, we are talking about what are revenues? What is a budget, right? At the local level, at your school level, at the district level, at the state level, how do these budgets reflect the values that we want reflected in them? And let's connect people to that so they understand what that means. It's their investments in local services, their investments in parks, their investments in education, their investments in health services. But if we don't have that understanding, then we can't demand that accountability from those leaders, whether they look like us or not, to be able to support those measures and be able to pass them. And I think that's a critical piece of the opportunity that we have ahead, is how we're seizing it and how we're ensuring that we're bringing community with us by raising that education and the awareness of the issues.
To take advantage of that one-time opportunity. Eric, before we turn it to the audience, wonder if there's anything you wanted to share, either reflecting on these comments or share anything from the perspective of Native communities and the types of coalitions that you were talking about earlier.
I think I'll keep it brief. I just want to really back up the need to invest in this, in the policy side of things. You know, my background's all law and policy, and I eventually moved into philanthropy, but you know, I have seen when I ended up in Washington, D.C., after having worked on the grassroots level for a long time and doing a lot of other legal issues, we had some better pathways in some organizations to connect those grassroots coalition and that voice, a lot of what Marco was saying. And I'm seeing a lot of that breaking down. Even what we actually had across a lot of coalitions and organizations where we relied on labor and all sorts of other folks to kind of help us keep that voice and accountability isn't there. And it was always so hard to raise the funding to invest in those policy experts that we had to, you know, poach away from other sectors and industries and all sorts of other things. And so I feel like too often that is a really big problem, and funders do need to start thinking about all the different ways they can be investing in all kinds of C3 infrastructure to build that whole voice, especially with these dollars on the table. I mean, we're just seeing so many different ways. What we're dealing with in Indian country and how those dollars aren't flowing is very different, you know, than in Los Angeles or other places. And all of those contexts are so different. They're going to need a lot of policy help to get that done right, to get those budgets defined at the community level. So we need to have that you know, force of our own people doing that work, and that's going to take a lot of investment.
Yeah, and as well as the type of investment and policy work by national foundations that Marco and Antonio were talking about. You're saying it's also local funders investing in the policy capacity of partners in their particular communities because those contexts are so different. Good. Questions either here in the room or, oh yes, we've got a question from outside the room. Yay, hybrid model. Can't hear you yet.
Okay.
There we go. Thanks.
You mentioned that there's a lack of Latino voices in Washington. What can philanthropy do to help increase Latinos running for office?
Great question.
Well, I don't think they can give directly to campaigns, which would be the first solution. But if they can, hey, ask your lawyers. But I think they can create, well, a couple of things. One, they can create the conditions for more Latinos to get elected to office. So for example, what is an absolutely, and in fact should be even more than it is, nonpartisan issue, for example, is district apportionment, right? And that's something that's being fiercely debated right now all over the country, right? And I think philanthropy can support efforts to do real data analysis on that, to expose the biases, to expose the machinations that sometimes are being done, to manufacture elected districts, sometimes to benefit one group and sometimes to disadvantage groups like the Latino community. So that's one thing right there. They also can look at also policies, which again are really hot these days, issues like voting rights. Again, analysis, not necessarily funding elections. I know philanthropy gets nervous about all that, but looking at civil rights and access and the whether it be legal cases or it be analysis and research and advocacy around things that determine who gets to vote in elections, as Vanessa was alluded to. Sometimes just having a high number of people in a particular community does not ensure that that community is going to be well represented in public office. So there's those things. And then lastly, the one thing I'd say, and certainly it's self-serving, so I left it for last, but investing in leadership pipeline type programs and organizations that actually help prepare people to be, whether it be political candidates, whether it be political staff, whether it be folks involved in the public policy process and legislative process in some way, shape, or form. There's also plenty that can be done from a purely nonpartisan C3 perspective that helps prepare people and to even help people consider thinking about running for office. Then you can let the private sector and individuals and other folks who are able to legally invest in candidates and in elections and so on, take on that part of it once there are enough people who are raising their hands saying, I'd like to run.
Antonia, did you want to add anything?
Well, I think it's really important to have ethnic representation, but just because you're Latino, Latina doesn't mean that you understand the issues of our community. You have to have someone who deeply cares about our community, who understands the community, and is willing to represent the community. So I would say what Marco said, plus the quality of the person. And I think that that's really, really important, but it doesn't go with politics. It's the same thing in philanthropy. Are you seeking office or a position for power, or are you seeking that position in that office to do good and to change the conditions of society? And they have to go hand in hand. I tell people, you need to seek to have power, because without power, you can't do a damn thing. But what are you doing with that power and that influence that really matters? So I would say, yes, definitely. And I think young people need to understand that it's hard being an elected official. I mean, it is really, really hard. It's not for the faint of heart, but they have to have Corazon and they have to have the fire in the belly.
If I could just leave folks though with one stat, because I completely agree. Vanessa made that point earlier as well. That there's an old phrase a good friend says that just because you're skin folk doesn't mean you're kin folk, right? Just a person looking like us doesn't have our reputation. I, however, being both the optimist and the obsessive about it, really think in some ways that would be a good problem to have of too many folks who look like us who are not representing our agendas. Because the reality is, according to my friends at NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected Appointed Officials, when you add up federal, state, and local elected positions throughout the United States, the Latino population, who is roughly 19% of the United States population, holds 1% of the elected positions, right? In my mind, really, the starting point is that there's too few of us. When we get a few more in, we also then absolutely can make sure and ensure and guarantee that they represent our interests. But I think at the moment right now, we have too few of either kind.
And it's a vehicle, it's not the destination.
Absolutely.
It's having the representation, more equivalent to the community and the population. I would also say, so we put out a Latino Scorecard report recently, just a couple of months ago, it was released. And in it, we cover 5 different areas. One theme topic is civic engagement. And in that civic engagement section, one of our policy recommendations is to support organizations that are creating that access, that leadership pipeline access. And there's organizations that do that. I'll give one as an example. Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, HOPE, that does that. There's not enough of that. And the access to funding is also very restricted. It costs a lot of money to run for office. Latinos don't normally have the same access to the same types of resources that our white counterparts do or others do. So I think those programs are really necessary.
Wonderful. Well, it's such a compelling picture that you all have painted of a series of actors who are activated, whether it's companies or district offices or nonprofit leaders who are recognizing the urgency of this moment and the need to collaborate. There are proven solutions and proven things that have been said for many years from stages like this, and there are new and unique opportunities that is urgent for us all to take advantage of from whatever seat we may have on the bus, to use Ana Maria's image. Please join me in thanking Eric, Vanessa, Marco, and Antonia for this compelling discussion.
All right.